So, what is learning? And I want us all to sort of think about this and, come up with our own definitions to really think about, what does it mean to learn something? And many people, when they think about learning, they think about experience. They think about something happening. They do something and there's a consequence, or they encounter something and they respond, or they, over time, determine, from multiple experiences that, this means that and this predicts this and all that kind of stuff. So it really has to do with sort of changes in our behavior, right, that are brought on by experience. And then we can, sort of demonstrate that we have learned because we have a change in our behavior, a subsequent change in our behavior. And we're going to see this week that, there's different forms of learning that have been kind of investigated by psychologists and by, behavioral neuroscientists, actually. Many of these, involve what we call non-associative learning, like a lot of studies. There's a very famous neuroscientist named Eric Kandel who won the Nobel Prize for his work on learning and memory by studying what we call non-associative forms of learning. This is, learning, based on repeated exposure to a stimulus. So we're not talking about stimulus contingencies or, temporal relations between stimuli, but just responses, not associative responses, but just responses to stimuli. And, with familiarity, with repeated exposure to a stimulus, we can reduce our responsiveness to that stimulus. That's called habituation. We can respond less with repeated exposure, or we can actually end up responding more, and that's called sensitization. And habituation and sensitization, which were studied rather intensively by Eric Kandel, and we'll look at his work with an organism called the Aplysia, which is like a sea slug. These are what we call non-associative forms of learning. But then there are also the associative forms of learning, where there are contingencies between stimuli, that one stimulus may predict, the appearance of another, or the presence of a stimulus may, suggest that if we do something, based on past experience, we'll get rewarded, or we might get punished, right? So we're going to learn a little bit about what's called associative learning. And there's some famous, behaviorists who got very much involved in the study of associative learning, including Ivan Pavlov, who famously worked in a paradigm known as classical conditioning, and we'll talk about classical conditioning, and also B.F. Skinner and, the sometimes appalling John Watson, who basically worked in, what we call operant conditioning, where the presence of a stimulus indicates that if we do something, if we respond, if we operate on our environment, we can expect a particular outcome. So learning is change in an organism's behavior brought on by experience. And there are non-associative forms like habituation and sensitization, and there are also associative forms like classical conditioning and operant conditioning. And one other point I just want to make clearly here is how when we learn something, we have an experience and we change our behavior. If that change is relatively short-lived, right? It's not something that we're going to retain for the long haul. It often involves, sort of short-term kind of functional changes in synapses. Like they respond more, respond less. But these are short-term functional changes. However, if we learn something that persists, that lasts a long time, that persists into the future, our behavior has rather dramatically changed, or just changed, but changed, for a long time in response to experiences. That generally requires changes in gene expression, and thus changes in protein synthesis, and thus building new structures and new, sometimes strengthening existing synapses, for the long term, sometimes weakening existing synapses, sometimes growing new synapses or removing new synapses. Sometimes, giving up on specific circuits in the brain, like actually having cells, die off and leave because they're not, useful in, this new network that reflects the past experience and the learning that occurred. So long term, episodes of learning involve real, actual structural change in connectivity in all these networks in our brains, that make us, who we are.